Look here, man. You hold back from turning the loaves, which you see burning, but you're glad to eat them when freshly cooked. These were the words of a simple Anglo Saxon housewife who was miffed at her house guest who had failed to keep a close eye on the food that was being prepared. The housewife was a busy woman, being the wife of a swineherd. With her husband busy tending to the pigs, she had to potter around doing all the essential daily household chores. The arrival of this unknown guest that she and her husband had taken in was a surprise. Maybe he was a welcome distraction from the drudgery of daily living, or perhaps he was getting under their feet. The tone of the woman's words would suggest the latter. It was apparent that the swineherd's wife, and probably the swineherd himself, had no real idea of who this guest actually was. It was obvious that the guest was a warrior of some sort. As the loaves slowly began to burn, the visitor sat by the hearth, fiddling with his bows and arrows. Clues enough as to the intentions and identity of this man. The swineherd and his wife lived in a simple village in Somerset. Across what we now call England, the country was being overrun by the Vikings, and it was from the Vikings that this unknown visitor had sought refuge with these simple people. His appearance, too, would have given strong clues as to his recent whereabouts. He and a small group of followers had trudged through woodland and forests, muddied and battered and bruised. They had been forced to hide in marshes and swamps, where they became sodden, drenched, and in all likelihood thoroughly miserable. So, for the swineherd's wife, it would have been apparent that the man she was now chastising was a fighting man, a man of war. This did not prevent her from speaking her mind over the irritation of the burnt loaves, giving an insight into her own rugged and strong willed personality. Perhaps if she had known that the man sitting before her was in fact a king, she may have chosen her words and tone more carefully. Not only was this man a king, but he was also a man the future of the kingdom of Wessex depended upon. Beyond that, although obviously beyond his own and anybody of that exact time's knowledge, the future of a unified England rested upon this man's shoulders. Of course, the man in question was Alfred the Great. The story of the burning of the cakes, or more likely bread, is common knowledge. What is less commonly recognised is the difficulties that Alfred faced at the time this famous story allegedly occurred. Relentlessly pressed by the Vikings, Alfred was not a man who would retreat easily or willingly, but by 878 he was presented with no choice. With large parts of England already in Viking control, the Danes were now threatening Wessex and potentially a full conquest of England. As he prepared his bows and arrows and other weapons of war by the hearth, Alfred would have known his own personal future was at a critical point. He was a sufferer of Crohn's disease, and a future marching through swamps and woods was hardly a tempting proposition for him. He had only escaped to relative safety with a small number of men. If he was to regain control of Wessex and drive the Vikings back, he must rally his supporters, those who still believed in him anyway. Others had decided the safest course of action for them was to make a deal with the Vikings. It was from these treacherous Englishmen, as well as the Danes themselves, that Alfred launched a series of daring raids on stealing food and supplies to ensure his and his men's survival. Shortly after Easter 878, Alfred launched his counterattack. At Athelney, supported by those most loyal to him, and who had also gone into hiding with him, Alfred erected a fortress. From here, he could assemble an army and begin to launch steadily more effective raids on the enemy. Alfred would be greeted by men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. The joy at seeing their king alive and resolute, as though, in the words of Alfred's biographer Asa, he had come back from the dead, was overwhelming for many. The scenes were, for a time, joyous, and perhaps Alfred, to some extent, must have been overcome with emotion himself. However, this was not the time to lose their heads. Alfred and his men knew that duty called. The future of their kingdom, their wives and children, their homes, now depended on them hunting down the Vikings and defeating them, driving them from Wessex. The showdown would be fought at Edington in Wiltshire. Alfred, having campaigned alongside his brother Athelred I, up to now had a patchy record in battle, but defeat was not an option any more. Alfred and his men stood side by side, forming an impenetrable shield wall, and marched forwards towards their onrushing enemy. The fighting at Edington was fierce, brutal, and devastating, but the English were victorious, driving the Vikings to flight. But Alfred was not content with this. He needed and wanted total victory, and pursued the retreating enemy to their hiding place, laying siege to their fortress, looting and killing whatever and whomever he found outside the walls in the process. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles states that the siege lasted for a fortnight before the Danes came to terms. Starving and exhausted from the exertions of the previous few weeks, the Danish army handed over hostages to Alfred, which, according to Asa, were hand-picked by the King of Wessex himself. Alfred knew that agreements like this had been made before, and very often the Vikings had reneged on promises almost immediately. The peace needed to go further. And so it was that 30 of the leading men of the Danish army, including Guthrum, King of East Anglia, came to meet Alfred and were baptized as Christians. The Battle of Edington was not only an important moment in English history, but also in the story of the Vikings as a milestone in the gradual Christianization of these fierce pagan warriors. Of course, they continued to cause chaos long after Alfred's time. The Battle of Edington was a critical moment. What if Alfred had lost, or even worse, killed? Who or what would have prevented the Danes from total conquest of England? The course of English history takes on an entirely different perspective, and indeed there may have been no such thing as England had Alfred been defeated at Edington. As it was, Alfred, this rugged, battle-hardened, ill, yet pious and studious man, did triumph. The Danish army, after Alfred had spent some time with Guthrum, retreated to Cirencester before moving back into East Anglia. There was, for Alfred, much more left to do. Edington had brought him time, but no peace agreement or single victory in battle could guarantee a king peace in the age of the Vikings. Eventually, expansion would be next on the agenda for Alfred and his successors.